committee will please come to order. This morning, I want to begin by acknowledging the sad incident in Alexandria, Virginia this morning, and to commend the service of the U.S. Capitol Police. Our thoughts are with those who are injured. I hope for their speedy, full recovery. Today, we are here to receive the testimony for the budget request submitted by the Department of Defense to the Congress for the next fiscal year. We're pleased to have with us today the Honorable James N. Mattis, Secretary of Defense, General Joseph F. Dunford, Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are very pleased with their attendance and providing us with our needs for reviewing the budget request. We're pleased to have Secretary Mattis and Chairman Dunford here for their second appearance before the subcommittee this year. We thank you for your distinguished service and your commitment to the defense of our nation. We thank you for your commitment to the safety and security of our nation. We look forward to receiving and considering the budget request formally from the Department of Defense. Our distinguished group of staff members who help us review this and do the work of this under this subcommittee's jurisdiction and our full committee's jurisdiction. So we're pleased to begin our review of the request by hearing directly from the Vice Chairman, Chairman Durbin. Senator from Illinois is not with us yet, but we will give Senator Leahy the honor of making whatever remarks he would like at this opening statement time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll put my full remarks in the record, but I know that it's important that Secretary Mattis and General Dunford are here. They're both men of integrity. I've known them for years, and I think we'll benefit from their expertise and candor. They also, I think, realize we can't maintain the strongest military at the expense of our domestic priorities. It's not an either-or thing, because it would make us neither safe nor strong nor great. Our national security is not limited just to the activities of the Department of Defense. Secretary Mattis, you said that historically, nations that didn't keep their fiscal house in order, their economy strong, lose their military power. We have to decide how to do that. I agree with your conclusion. But I don't think that we can set up a budget that says it's either or. We've got to look at both. We talk about parity for defense and non-defense spending. They're intrinsically linked. We can't be both militarily strong while economically weak. So I will work with the chairman in my capacity as vice chairman to see what we can do to have bills that do that. And I just state as a personal note, I don't want to embarrass General Dunford, but in Vermont, we were very pleased to have the general come to St. Michael's College, where he got his undergraduate degree before he got his graduate degree at Georgetown. He was a graduation speaker. I was there, even though I think I graduated decades before he was born, but it was the welcoming, Mr. Secretary, the welcome you saw for General Dunford from all across the political spectrum, military and non-military alike, was tremendous, It made the Marines proud, made the Department of Defense proud. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We now recognize the distinguished senator from Illinois, Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, first let me apologize, and it turns out it's all Chuck Grassley's fault. The Senate Judiciary Committee had a hearing that began on nominations this morning, and I'm sorry that I'm a few minutes late, meaning no disrespect to you, Mr. Secretary, our General, or the guests in our audience. I'll ask that my opening statement be made part of the record.
Without objection, the statement will be reported in the record. You may proceed.
Chairman Cochran, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the committee, I appreciate this opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for the fiscal year 2018. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for accepting my written statement for the record. I am joined today, of course, by Chairman Dunford, the Chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. I also have Chairman and Ranking Member, the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, David Norquist, recently confirmed by the Senate and sworn in. Should we need more detailed answers, your staff has been kind enough to set up a seat for him. We can call him forward if you so choose, Chairman. This budget request holds me accountable to the men and women of the Department of Defense. Every day, more than 2 million service members and nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, honoring previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for our country. It's my privilege to serve alongside them. We in the Department are keenly aware of the sacrifices made by the American people to fund our military. Many times in the past, we have looked reality in the eye, met challenges with the help of congressional leadership, and built the most capable warfighting force in the world. There is no room for complacency in the Department of Defense, and we have no God-given right to victory on the battlefield. Each generation of Americans, from the halls of Congress to the battlefields, earns victory through commitment and sacrifice. And yet, for 4 years, the Department has been subjected to or threatened by automatic across-the-board cuts as a result of sequester, a mechanism meant to be so injurious to the military it would never go into effect. But it did go into effect, and as forecast by then Secretary of Defense Panetta, the damage has been severe. In addition, during 9 of the past 10 years, Congress has enacted 30 separate continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, thus inhibiting our readiness and adaptation to new challenges. We need bipartisan support for this request. In the past, by failing to pass a budget on time or to eliminate the threat of sequestration, Congress sidelined itself from its active constitutional oversight role. Continuing resolutions coupled with sequestration blocked new programs, prevented service growth, stalled industry initiative, and placed troops at greater risk. Despite the tremendous efforts of this committee, Congress as a whole has met the present challenge with lassitude, not leadership. I retired from military service 3 months after sequestration took effect. 4 years later, I've returned to the Department. I have been shocked by what I've seen about our readiness to fight. While nothing can compare to the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more to harm the combat readiness of our military than sequestration. We have only sustained our ability to meet America's commitments for our security because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden. But our troops' stoic commitment cannot reduce the growing risk. It took us years to get into this situation. It will require years of stable budgets and increased funding to get us out of it. I urge members of this committee and Congress to achieve 3 goals. First, fully fund our request, which required an increase to the defense budget caps. Second, pass a FY 2018 budget in a timely manner to avoid yet another harmful continuing resolution. And third, eliminate the threat of future sequestration cuts to provide a stable budgetary planning horizon. Stable budgets and increased funding are necessary because of 4 external factors acting on the Department at the same time. The first force acting on us that we must recognize is 16 years of war. When Congress approved the all-volunteer force in 1973, our country never envisioned sending our military to war for more than a decade without pause or conscription. America's long war has placed a heavy burden on men and women in uniform and their families. Here, I will note a few points on Afghanistan, recognizing our military posture there is part of a larger regional context in South Asia. Our primary national interest and the international interest in Afghanistan is ensuring it does not become an ungoverned space from which attacks can be launched against the United States, other nations, or the Afghan people. In this regard, our forces are conducting partnered counterterrorism operations, and we are supporting the NATO-led Resolute Support mission, so in the future the Afghan people can defend themselves. At noon yesterday, President Trump delegated to me the authority to manage troop numbers in Afghanistan. The delegation of this authority, consistent with the authority President Trump granted me 2 months ago for Iraq and Syria, does not at this time change the troop numbers for Afghanistan. Together in the interagency, we will define the way ahead, and I will set the U.S. military commitment consistent with the Commander-in-Chief's strategic direction and his foreign policy as dictated by Secretary of State Tillerson. This ensures the Department can facilitate our missions and nimbly align our commitment to the situation on the ground. Our overall mission in Afghanistan remains the same: to train, advise, and assist the Afghan forces so they can safeguard the Afghan people and terrorists can find no haven in Afghanistan for attacking us or others. The revised Afghanistan strategy with a new approach will be presented to the President for his approval in the coming weeks. A second concurrent force acting on the Department is the worsening global security situation, and here we must look reality in the eye. Russia and China are seeking veto power over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions of nations on their periphery. North Korea's reckless rhetoric and provocative actions continue despite United Nations censure and sanctions, while Iran remains the largest long-term challenge to Mideast stability. All the while, terrorist groups murder the innocent and threaten peace in many regions while targeting us. A third force we have to deal with is adversaries actively contesting America's capabilities. For decades, the United States enjoyed uncontested or dominant superiority in every operating domain or realm. We could generally deploy our forces when we wanted, assemble them where we wanted, and operate how we wanted. Today, every operating domain, outer space, air, sea, undersea, land, and cyberspace, is contested. A fourth concurrent force is the rapid technological change, and among the other forces noted thus far, technological change is one that necessitates new investment, innovative approaches, and new program starts that have been denied us by law when we have been forced to operate under continuing resolutions. Each of these four forces, 16 years of war, the worsening security environment, contested operations in multiple domains, and the rapid pace of technological change require stable budgets and increased funding to provide for the protection of our citizens and for the survival of our freedoms. I reiterate that security and solvency are my watchwords as Secretary of Defense. The fundamental responsibility of our government is to defend the American people, providing for our security. And we cannot defend America and help others if our nation is not both strong and solvent. So we in the Department of Defense owe it to the American public and the Congress to ensure we spend each dollar wisely. President Trump has nominated for Senate approval specific individuals who will bring proven skills to discipline our department's fiscal processes and to ensure we do so. The first step to restoring readiness is underway thanks to Congress's willingness to support the administration's request for an additional $21 billion in resources for FY 2017 to address vital warfighting readiness shortfalls. Your support has put more aircraft in the air, more ships to sea, and more troops in the field. However, we all recognize that it will take a number of years of higher funding delivered on time to restore readiness. To strengthen the military, President Trump requested a $639 billion top line for the FY 2018 defense budget. That budget reflects 5 priorities. Our first priority is continuing to improve warfighter readiness begun in 2017, filling in the holes from trade-offs made during 16 years of war, 9 years of continuing resolutions, and Budget Control Act caps. The second priority is increasing capacity and lethality while preparing for future investment, driven by the results from the National Defense Strategy we are working on now. Our FY 2018 budget request ensures the nation's concurrent nuclear deterrent will be sustained and supports continuation of its much-needed modernization process. The third priority is reforming how the department does business. I am devoted to gaining full value from every taxpayer dollar spent on defense, thereby earning the trust of Congress and the American people. We have begun implementation of a range of reform initiatives directed by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, and we are on track to enter into a full agency-wide financial statement audit as required by statute. I urge Congress to support the Department's request for authority to conduct a 2021 base realignment and closure, or BRAC round. I recognize the careful deliberation that members must exercise in considering this, but BRAC has proven to be one of the most successful and significant efficiency programs we have. We forecast that a properly focused base closure effort could generate $2 billion or more annually. And over a 5-year period, that savings would be enough to buy 300 Apache attack helicopters or 120 F-18s or 4 Virginia-class submarines. The fourth priority in the FY 2018 budget request is keeping faith with service members and their families. Talented people remain the Department's most valuable asset, but we must continually balance these requirements of investing in our people against other investments critical to readiness, equipment, and modernization to ensure the military is the most capable warfighting force in the world. Investment in military compensation, blended retirement, the military health system, and family programs are essential to fielding the talent we need to sustain our competitive advantage on the battlefield. Our fifth priority is support for overseas contingency operations. The fiscal year 2018 President's budget requests $64.6 billion, focusing on operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, increasing efforts to sustain NATO's defenses to deter aggression and global counterterrorism operations. ISIS and other terrorist organizations represent a clear and present danger, and I am also encouraged by the willingness of our allies and partners to share the burden of this campaign alongside us. Moving forward, the FY 2019 budget will be informed by the National Defense Strategy. It will have to make hard choices as we shape the 2019 to 2023 defense program. The Department will work with President Trump, Congress, and this committee to ensure future budget requests are sustainable and provide the Commander-in-Chief with viable military options that support America's security. In summation, first, I need the BCA caps lifted and a budget, not a continuing resolution, passed on time, and elimination of future sequestration cuts so we can provide that stable and adequate way ahead that's needed on the budget. For those who are concerned, we are not asking for sufficient dollars. Please consider the following. For 2017, as a supplemental, we asked for $30 billion, and the Congress provided $21 billion for our administration to address readiness shortfalls. Second, this fiscal year, President Trump has requested $574 billion plus $29 billion in the Department of Energy budget plus $65 billion for overseas contingency operations. This is a 5% growth over what national defense was funded for 2017. This request is $52 billion above the Budget Control Act's defense caps. We have underway at this time a national security strategy review that will give us the analytical rigor to come back to you for the FY 2019 to 23 budget requests, when we will build up our military to confront the situation that the chairman and I have laid out in our written statements. I am keenly aware that each of you understands the responsibility we share to ensure our military is ready to fight today and in the future. I need your help to inform your fellow members of Congress about the reality facing our military and the need for Congress as a whole to pass a defense budget on time. And specifically, I want to thank the members of this committee for your strong support over many years through good times and bad, and for ensuring our troops have the resources and equipment they need to fight and win on the battlefield. I pledge to collaborate closely with you for the defense of our nation in our joint effort to keep our armed forces second to none. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Chairman Dunford is prepared to discuss the military dimensions of our budget request.
Chair now recognizes the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford.
Chairman Cochran.
General Dunford, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Cochran, Ranking Member Durbin, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to join Secretary Mattis in testifying before you today. I'm honored to represent your men and women in uniform, and it's because of them and your support that I can begin by saying with confidence that your armed forces remain the most capable in the world. However, that competitive advantage that the United States military has long enjoyed is eroding, and a number of factors have contributed to that erosion. Since 9/11, an extraordinarily high level of operational tempo has accelerated the wear and tear on our weapons and equipment. Meanwhile, budget instability and the Budget Control Act have forced the department to operate with far fewer resources than required to execute the strategy of record. As a consequence, we prioritize near-term readiness at the expense of replacing aged equipment and capability development. We also maintained a force that consumes readiness as fast as we can build it, and we lack sufficient capacity to meet our current operational requirements while rebuilding and maintaining what we describe as full-spectrum readiness. The Secretary and the service chiefs have been up and addressed this dynamic in their testimonies, and I fully concur with their assessments. But beyond current readiness, we're confronted with another significant challenge that I assess to be near-term. While we've been primarily focused on the threat of violent extremism, our adversaries and our potential adversaries have developed advanced capabilities and operational approaches specifically designed to limit our ability to project power. They recognize that our ability to project power is the critical capability necessary for us to defend the homeland, advance our interests, and meet our alliance commitments. And as Secretary Mattis mentioned, today, Russia, China, and Iran, they field a wide range of cyber, space, aviation, maritime, and land capabilities, and those are specifically designed to limit our ability to deploy, to employ, and to sustain our forces. Russia and China have also modernized their nuclear arsenal, while North Korea has been on a relentless path to field a nuclear-armed ICBM that can reach the United States, and of course that's well documented. In just a few years, if we don't change the trajectory, we will lose our qualitative and quantitative competitive advantage, and the consequences will be profound in my judgment. It'll adversely affect our nuclear deterrence, our conventional deterrence, and our ability to respond should deterrence fail. Alternatively, we can maintain our competitive advantage with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. To that end, the FY18 budget request is an essential step, and it builds on the FY17 supplemental that the Secretary mentioned. But this request is not going to fully restore readiness or arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage. Doing that is going to require sustained investment beyond FY18. Specific recommendations for FY19 and beyond are going to be informed by the Secretary's forthcoming National Defense Strategy. However, we know right now that continued growth in the base budget of at least 3% above inflation is the floor necessary to preserve the relative competitive advantage we have today. Not build the force of tomorrow, but to maintain the relative competitive advantage that we have today. As we ask for your support, we recognize the responsibility to maintain the trust of the American taxpayer. And we take this responsibility seriously and will continue to eliminate redundancies and achieve efficiencies wherever possible. Thanks again for the opportunity to appear before you this morning, and more importantly, thanks for all you do to ensure that young Americans never find themselves in a fair fight. And with that, Chairman, I'm prepared to take questions.
The chair recognizes the distinguished senator from Illinois, Richard Durbin.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, thank you again for being before the committee. Secretary Mattis, I voted for you to be the Secretary of Defense. We have some differences, but I respect you very much and the service you've given this country. But there was another reason. We have a President of the United States with no political or military background whatsoever. And he comes to this job, one of the most awesome responsibilities in the world is Commander-in-Chief of the greatest military in the world from my point of view, and I imagine you share that. There may come a moment, I hope it doesn't, where he has to make a fateful decision in a matter of minutes that could involve the loss or jeopardy of thousands of lives. I'm hoping in those few minutes he picks up the phone and calls you and others like you who have seen war, who understand the brave men and women who serve our country and have had the terrible responsibility of sending them into battle knowing that all of them would not come home. That's why I voted for you, and that's why I still stand behind you. But I look at the situation in Afghanistan and the President's recent delegation of authority to you, and I have some questions which I would like to address to you because they get to the heart of why we're in Afghanistan, what our goal is, and how it impacts the budget that you put before us today. It was recently written, the Afghan security forces have fought bravely but lack adequate air power, leadership, retention rates, and coalition support to stem the tide of the resurgent Taliban. The Taliban now controls more ground than at any point since this war began in year 2001. We are in the 16th year of this, the longest war in American history. I joined 22 of my colleagues in voting against the invasion of Iraq, but I voted for the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, going after those responsible for that terrible loss of American life. We have given, as a nation, and families have given 2,300 American lives in Afghanistan. We have spent billions of dollars. We are now dealing with a government in its third year, which is universally viewed as corrupt, inept, and too weak to govern. And yet, we hear this president and others say it's time to send in more American troops. I'd like to ask you at this point, what are the likely prospects that sending more military troops, risking more American lives, spending billions more in dollars will make any difference 16 years from now than it has in the first 16 years?
Senator, it's a fair question. I would say that the reason we have not been attacked over many years from where that 9/11 attack originated is heavily due to the sacrifices that we have made over years as we kept the enemy on the back foot. It's hard for them to conduct external operations out of that former stronghold when they're just trying to hang on to their own lives and avoid us. I believe that we pulled out our forces at a time, as you know, when the violence was lower, but we pulled them out on a timeline rather than consistent with the maturation of the government and the security forces. The result was that as security declined, all the other stresses have come to bear, to include heavy casualties on the part of the Afghan forces. Other nations pulled their forces out as well. And further, the Taliban was emboldened. So why would I come to you and tell you there's some alternative now where we put some forces back in? We would have to change the priorities, and we would have to put it in a more regional construct, any kind of force increase. By regional construct, I mean we consider things, issues from India and Pakistan all the way over to Iran because of the bordering nations. And ignoring those means you put in a strategy that has not taken into account some of the most fundamental factors that will impact on its success or failure. More importantly, we restore the high ground, and that is a place where the NATO air forces are dominant overhead. But at one point, when we reduced our forces there, I believe in what was probably in hindsight a misguided application of our forces. We restricted them from using our air support with some idea that we would wean them off the need of it. That meant in the mountain country, these troops were often fighting at a disadvantage. So we changed the way we fight, we changed the regional construct, and we changed our approach to how we deal with this government.
If I might ask you this question, Mr. Secretary, just a few years ago under President Obama, we had almost 100,000 American troops.
Yes.
We are now down to roughly 10,000 at the current time, counting NATO forces, I believe. Do you see us returning to those troop levels of a few years ago, 100,000 or beyond?
No, sir, I do not.
Could you give me some range of what you expect us to commit?
Sir, I need to equate the lines of effort that we need under a refreshed, a new approach, and then I will come up and I will sit down with you. I'm talking about within weeks, not months. I will come up and brief you and any of your colleagues. I think right now what we have to look at is what kind of capabilities do we bring to them, because the Afghans have proven they will fight. They have suffered horrible losses, and they keep fighting. They're not fighting as well as they could if we gave them the kind of air support, more intel support that we could give them, and also if we brought more diplomatic and economic pressures on surrounding nations, perhaps. So it's a much broader whole-of-government approach that Secretary Tillerson and I meet on every week as we put together a State Department-led foreign policy with a military strategy to help carry it out.
Thank you, sir.
Time of the senator has expired. The distinguished senator from Alabama, Richard Shelby.
Thank you. General Dunford, I'll start with you. When Admiral Harris, who's commander of the Pacific Command, recently testified to the Senate, he said that getting to the president's stated goal of at least 350 ships would enable him to meet what he called his steady state requirements in the Pacific theater. In other words, to keep the risk down when responding to possible Chinese coercion or North Korean aggression. He also said that we need to grow the size of the Navy fleet and we need to make our ships more lethal. Do you agree with Admiral Harris?
Senator, I've participated including my previous assignment as a commandant in the Marine Corps, in studies to assess the numbers of ships that are required for security. And I think Admiral Harris's numbers are right to meet his requirement. Of course, our priorities that we provided to you this year are within the top line that we've given. I think what's an important point, though, I just want to reemphasize, when I spoke about the minimum amount of money that we would need to maintain our competitive advantage at about 3%, in order to get to the 355 ships and grow the Army and the Air Force commensurately, those numbers really are closer to 5 and beyond. And so to get to a 355-ship Navy would require us significant more resources. So what we try to do in 18 is maintain the ship profile that we're on. You'll see it's the same as it was in 2017 in terms of numbers of ships in the program. And while we would want to grow, we simply haven't had the top line that allows us to do that.
And in growing that fleet, is the LCS very important to that mission?
The LCS is very important, particularly as the Navy looks for ways to increase the lethality of the LCS and really have that perform a mission more like a frigate than it had been envisioned.
Along those lines, the industrial base of the Navy and the Army is critical, I believe. Would you be in a position to assess the existing opportunities in the Navy's Seahawk helicopter manufacturing base that provides our ships with the warfighting equipment that make the U.S. fleet effective? I think that's important. And also, Secretary Mattis, the U.S. Army has unfunded requirements dealing with the Stryker, you know, the upgrades and so forth. Mr. Secretary, would you work with this committee to try to protect that industrial base, also produce the best equipment too?
I would, Senator.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I've reviewed the Army's unfunded priority list, Senator, and I think the priorities we have in the base budget are right. If we got more money, I think they have laid out a pretty good program.
Sure. To assure our access to space, which is very important, as everybody knows here, could you provide the committee with an update on the status of the department's efforts to replace the Russian-made RD-180 engine? You know, we're working on that to have an American engine rather than rely on the Russians. And I know we've spent a lot of money in that area, and we want to finish it. Can you give us an update on that?
Sir, I can tell you that we're on track to replace it. It's going to take some time, just because these capabilities take time to rebuild.
We know.
But we're on track for it, Senator, and we can give you the timeline very shortly.
You furnish that for the record?
Absolutely.
In my limited time, Mr. Secretary, would you touch base with us right now on what we're doing in the Persian Gulf area to counter Iranian influence, the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, and has our position, our posture changed since the agreement was signed regarding nuclear weapons? Iran seems to be pretty aggressive everywhere in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf.
Sir, I believe the nuclear arms agreement is an imperfect arms control agreement, but it's not a friendship treaty. There are 4 other threats: ballistic missiles, cyber, counter-maritime, and terrorist. They have aggressively moved out on all of those, and you saw President Trump's trip out there to try to align the Arab nations and bury some of their differences as they confront this growing threat, and also with Israel, whose security is threatened by Iran. We are working the issues across the board. We are gaining interoperability with their forces through some of the arms sales that brings interoperability that we would need in order to deter Iranian influence. But there is no doubt, sir, that they are the leading cause of instability in the Middle East.
Could you touch briefly on North Korea, the threat there that we all concerned with as they have more and more capability, it seems?
Yes, sir. Preparing for the Senate confirmation, I met with the CIA. They told me this would be probably the earliest crisis I would face, so that was my first trip, was to the Pacific. I met both in Tokyo and Seoul with political and military leadership. We have, as you know, moved some ballistic missile protection, THAAD, into South Korea in a combined forces decision, political decision by the South Koreans. That is being reviewed by their new administration. But more importantly, the President invited the President of China to Mar-a-Lago, where we had extensive talks. There were only 2 subjects. This was half of those subjects. And right now, I think we are seeing assistance from China in dealing with this growing issue. The military options are uniformly very, very tough. They're very serious, and the effort right now, led by Secretary of State Tillerson, under the President's direction, is to find a diplomatic solution if there is anything along those lines possible. And it's full effort on this by all the interagency working with Secretary Tillerson.
Thank you.
Sir.
The time of the distinguished senator has expired. The chair now recognizes the distinguished senator from Vermont, Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Mattis, we had Secretary Tillerson before the committee, and I had read back a quote of yours when you said, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. The more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, hopefully the less we have to put into a military budget." And then in March, before this panel, you said America's got 2 fundamental powers: the power of intimidation and the power of inspiration. Soft power is largely found in the power of inspiration, and it's part and parcel of how we defeat the enemy. I agree with you. A lot of people here on the Hill agree with you. In fact, a number of former secretaries of defense and state, and from both parties, agree with you. The proposed 30% cut in the budget for diplomacy and development, called by some at the White House a way to improve efficiency and put America's security first. Which of the various proposed cuts, the Department of State and USAID, which of those cuts strengthen our national security? Nothing like giving you a tough question at the beginning.
I I enjoy testifying, sir, because get it straight up here. I have not looked, though, I have a pretty heavy load just trying to get my own budget under control. I have not looked at where the line item cuts come. I will tell you this, Senator Leahy, that when I read about it in the paper, I called Secretary Tillerson. We meet weekly. We talk several times a day, most days. And I told him that I was willing to take whatever development money I get, and as you're aware, I do get some for the various efforts. And we have a high level, the highest level except for he and I, conference going on where we are going to set priorities for the United States government, and our monies will be used to jointly go after this. Now, we'll maintain the separation and answer to each of the right committees, but I'll be able to show you how we have set these priorities in league with the State Department as we try to get the most response for the money that you give us by working best together.
Over the years, I've visited a number of war zones, nowhere near as many as you or General Dunford have, but I've seen the obvious necessity of our military power. But I've also heard almost universally from our commanders in the field how necessary it was to have also the soft power handled by the State Department or USAID. Now, the President's budget requests $52 billion over the caps established by the Budget Control Act. But if we don't lift the budget caps from 2 years ago, effectively we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, because spending above the defense cap would trigger a sequester across the board in defense, which would mean cutting readiness. You don't agree in us finding ways to cut readiness, do you?
No, sir, I do not. I think the budget control caps have to be repealed.
You testified earlier this week before the House Armed Services Committee that sequestration, coupled with adoption of continuing resolutions rather than full appropriations bills, hurts the Department of Defense. I've been on this committee for an awful lot of years. I like it a lot better when we do each one of the appropriations bills, vote them up or down, and have and work it out. Now, we were going to pass an omnibus spending bill last November. The president-elect asked us to have a 5-month continuing resolution, which was done. Now there's been a tweet saying we need a good shutdown of the government. I would assume you're not in favor of a shutdown, that you'd rather see us reach a budget agreement. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Let me ask what may sound parochial. Both the Army and the Air Force rely on our National Guard to fulfill missions. We're proud of our Guard in Vermont. General Dunford met with the head of it when he was up there, but we just deployed to the Middle East to cover a carrier gap. The Guard, the Air National Guard, was in the field literally in a matter of hours after arriving, having flown their F-16s to the Middle East, and we're in heavy combat. The Army, the Vermont Army National Guard is now integrated with the 10th Mountain Division. I got pictures of that to send to Senator Bob Dole, who is so proud of his action there. Now, I think there has to be a commitment, though, that they're going to get the funding they need. Will that money, General Dunford, will that be in the budget? And that's my last question.
It is in the budget, Senator, and we absolutely are sensitive to the fact that the Guard and Reserve really has transformed into an operational reserve over the last decade. We certainly couldn't have done what we've done in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere without the contribution of the National Guard, and we're committed to making sure that they have the same modern capabilities as our active duty force, because, as you suggest, they're employed in exactly the same way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the senator has expired. We now recognize the distinguished senator from Tennessee, Senator Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have 83 years of Marine experience at the table in front of us, and I thank you both for that distinguished those distinguished careers. Mr. Secretary, does President Trump unequivocally support NATO?
Absolutely.
Does President Trump unequivocally support Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty?
He has stated so, and I'm certain he does.
And you have stated so, and I believe Secretary Tillerson has stated so. I'd like to talk with you about the Baltics and that area and Russia for a moment. Visiting with the president of Finland a few days ago, he said they have a saying about Cossacks: they take everything that is loose. You have in the budget money for the European Reassurance Initiative and the enhanced forward presence. While several senators, including Senator Blunt, were there, it seemed to me that that relatively small commitment of rotating troops in the Baltic countries was having a desired effect of making it clear to Russia that if they moved into Lithuania, for example, that they would be running into troops from a number of NATO countries, or into Poland, for example, they'd be running into American troops with a rotating force. What's your opinion of the effectiveness of this forward lean, and is the money in your budget sufficient to provide the deterrence that we need?
Senator, we have $4.8 billion. It is sufficient. It's a growth of $1.4 billion over last year. I was up in the Lithuania forest here myself a couple weeks ago, and what you see are framework nations: Canada, the United Kingdom, the Americans, and Germany, each providing the core element of 4 battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Around those core elements, we add other forces, and so we in fact have probably 2/3 of NATO's forces now arrayed up there in the Baltics and Poland under these various battle groups. They're working well together. They understand why they're there, and I think they're sending a very clear message, an unambiguous message to Russia that NATO does not tolerate any moves against those nations.
I have 2 more short questions. You've been quoted as saying you're not concerned about the Russian exercise in the Baltic Sea area, although the United States apparently will have an increased presence in the Baltic Sea with ships and with air flights. Is there some risk of an accident or a mistake that could provoke a problem this August or September during that Russian exercise?
Sir, there will be increased activity, training activity by the Russians and by the NATO forces up there at that time. We're taking active efforts to try to deconflict, to try to avoid that sort of situation. And the chairman is in contact directly with his counterpart, General Gerasimov, not just on our relations in Syria and deconfliction there, but also more broadly. But it's something we always watch for. We're not complacent about it. But right now, I believe that it's not in their interest to provoke something. Every once in a while, they cause me to wonder about that. But so far, I think we're okay.
In Finland, we met with a Center for Hybrid Warfare, a little NATO organization just starting up, who told us about a warehouse in St. Petersburg with hundreds of Russians whose job is to use social media to try to disrupt and destabilize the countries in that area. Can you talk a little about that, or about hybrid warfare, what they're facing and what we are doing about that?
No, we've watched Russia try to change the character of what they were doing, whether it be in Crimea or up in the area that you're referring to here, using fake news. For example, as fast as the German battle group got on the ground in Lithuania, there was a completely made-up story put out by that organization about the rape of a Lithuanian girl by one of the German soldiers, completely fabricated, had nothing to do with reality. So it is a very real and present effort by the Russians. We're aware of it, and you see it in everything from fake news to mucking around other people's elections. It's a very broad-based effort that they shift the focus on from time to time.
My impression that the President's firmness on his NATO support helps send the message to Putin that destabilizing those countries is a stupid thing to do, and he should not miscalculate the United States' attitude. I appreciate your comments on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Next senator to be recognized is the distinguished senator from California, Ms. Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that, and welcome, gentlemen. Secretary Mattis, I wanted to speak with you briefly about our nuclear weapons. The CBO cost of modernizing our nuclear arsenal and weapons infrastructure is expected to be $1.2 trillion over 30 years. And to date, we have not prioritized which nuclear weapons are necessary for maintaining deterrence and which are not. The nuclear posture review, I hope, will prioritize nuclear weapons investments. It's my understanding you are the lead in that. Will it, in fact, give us some enlightenment as to which nuclear weapons are necessary for deterrence, since there is no limited use of nuclear weapons?
First, I just agree 100%. There's no limited use. I want to be clear on that. The Nuclear Posture Review will address that. I'm also going back and basically interrogating Dr. William Perry and Ms. Rose Gottmuller and other experts to make certain that we start from a position of knowledge and we're not rediscovering the wheel to answer that very question. We're looking at each leg of the triad, and we're looking at each weapon inside each leg. What I'm looking for is a deterrent that will be most compelling to make certain these weapons are never used.
Well, thank you. And let me ask you then that you take a good look at the new nuclear cruise missile. I've had an opportunity when Secretary Moniz was Secretary of Energy to look at the classified mock-ups of the old and the new, and I believe it is in fact a new nuclear weapon, and that's for another discussion in another place. It's got features which concern me greatly. I do not see it as an effective deterrent weapon. I see it as Russia taking action to counter it. And with the cost and the fact that we've got new ballistic missile submarines, new bombers, new intercontinental ballistic missiles, and new warheads, I wonder why we need to develop this specific weapon. The cost is going to be inordinate, and it's got some attributes which, if we have a classified session, or perhaps I could talk with you about, that concern me very greatly. So if you could respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
I can, Senator. Coming into the job, that was one of the weapons that I focused on initially. I've not yet completed my own review. I would say, though, that we have got to make certain the bombers can get through if they're to be a valid deterrent from these weapons ever being used. So how can we keep the bomber survivable and still have the standoff? And that's the issue I'm grappling with, but I register loud and clear the potential destabilizing view that some people see this weapon bringing, and I'm taking that on board, but I've got to do more study.
And you will look at its range as well as the ability to abort it?
I will look at that, Senator. We also have to look at an issue that Secretary Tillerson and I are dealing with right now, which is the pretty clear violations of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty by the Russians, and what does that change? Basically, what are the implications of that? And also some concerns we have about the Open Skies Treaty. Not that we want to walk away, but if Russia is in fact walking away, what are the implications to our deterrent posture, despite all the efforts by Russian and American leaders some years ago to try to get these treaties in place and make this part of the deterrent in effect. And if they're walking away, I've got to consider that as I look at this system.
I had the privilege, along with Senator Kyle, of going to Geneva when the Russian military were there on the agreement that we approved a short time ago, and I've just got a block in my mind, with Russia, the last agreement. The New START Treaty.
Right.
And I saw the reduction and the reductions agreed to, and I felt we were on a very good track.
Yeah.
I've talked to people in the military about the LRSO, and I'd like to talk to you about what they tell me, not here,
Yes, ma'am.
about the philosophy that they think is behind it, which I'm not sure will, and for the cost, that will end up with a practical deterrent.
I need to come up and say, I'd be eager to get that perspective, ma'am, because I want to give the right kind of guidance to this posture review.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
The time of the distinguished senator has expired. The the chairman recognizes the distinguished senator from Missouri, Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, very quickly, I want to thank you for the attention you've both given to a effort that I've been making along with Senator Gilderbrand for the Military Family Stability Act. Both of your offices have worked with us to the point that I think we now are confident we can do this with virtually no budgetary impact, but lots of flexibility for families that they don't currently have. In my first meeting with Secretary Mattis after he was nominated for this job, he quickly got how important it was to do something for families. And I think, General Dunford, when we've discussed this earlier, you've said your family's moved 20 times during your career. So if anybody would understand the challenges of moving and timing and how much difference flexibility would make, you certainly would as well. But I think we've worked to a point that we're hopeful to see that in the National Defense Authorization bill and have it in a way that it really will have no impact here. But either of you like to make any comments on that, I'd be pleased.
Senator, we've looked at it. Initially, I was told it could not be cost neutral. I said, that's not good enough. Go back and find a way to make it cost neutral. With personnel costs continuing to rise, we have got to keep them under control. I think we've got a way forward on it. We may need a little legislative relief about an entitlement that appears to say we can't do it this way. We'll work with you on this, sir.
Well, General Dunford.
Senator, first, I just want to thank you for your advocacy on military families. And at a time when, the economy is improving and it's difficult to recruit and retain high-quality people, initiatives like this are going to send a very powerful message that we actually do care about them and I hope encourage them to stay despite some of the challenges associated with family life in the military.
Well, I appreciate what you've both done to help us get to the point that I think we can solve that problem, and not only the commitment of families, but our investment in people who are serving and everything we can do to encourage them to continue to serve and to solve problems that we can solve. And I think this is one of them, and I hope we found a way to do that. Secretary Mattis, and actually this could relate to both of you, I want to turn to a project that is vital to our national security. It's the construction of the NGA West facility in North St. Louis. The budget request this year includes robust funding to begin that construction. I know you've been supportive of it. I think there's one final area that we need to resolve. Department of Defense officials, particularly the Air Force and the city of St. Louis, have been working on an agreement that would determine what environmental standards are necessary for the land transfer. I think we need to be sure